Hey guys, welcome back for another episode of The Suited Shootist. And as promised from last week's video, what I'm going to talk about today is my current thoughts and impressions on how I feel the 21-foot rule, or the Tueller principle, or the Tueller Drill, is kind of getting misapplied when I hear people talking about it in the defensive space. And I don't really ever hear it misrepresented from instructors. I seem most often, unsurprisingly, to see it misinterpreted by hobbyists, enthusiasts, stuff like that, because they are hearing an abridged version of it, either in a video or from an instructor, etc. And it's this game of telephone. So that's kind of what I want to touch on. I was actually going to try and do some practical data collection as well, but because I am little more than 3 ADHD raccoons in a trench coat, I can't currently find my mantis, so I wasn't going to try and just calculate times by watching video playback. But I think I got some benchmarks to work with here. So the 21-foot rule, as it is commonly, or as I see it commonly discussed, is, you don't want to let somebody inside 21 feet, or that 21 feet is this like hard line threshold wherein somebody with a contact weapon like a knife or a tire iron or something like that can still pose a deadly threat. And generally the focus of it is around the hard distance. I mean, it's commonly referred to these days as the 21-foot rule. But here's the thing. It ain't a rule, and, even the other sort of common term, the Tueller Drill, I don't necessarily know that qualifies as a drill either. A drill is typically something that you do repeatedly to refine a skill set, like the bill drill, or, something that's diagnostic. The bill drill, again, being a good example of that. My understanding is that the whole reason why Dennis Tueller did this thing in the first place was that there was a cop that was getting jammed up because he shot a suspect armed with a knife at a distance of some kind. And during the course of the investigation, they were giving him a hard time over, well, why did you shoot the guy when he was outside of arm's reach and no threat to you? So what they wound up doing was simply testing, okay, how much distance can an average person cover, and what is the approximate time that it takes a patrol officer to draw and get a hit from a duty rig. And what they were looking for was simply a comparison of the two. And what was determined was, generally speaking, it was more than 50% of the time the assailant was able to close 7 yards. And again, it was almost kind of an arbitrary number because that was the distance that that was being trained at when this particular question arose. But effectively, it was more than half the time the assailant could close that 7-yard distance in the approximate 1.5 seconds that the average patrol officer would take to draw and fire one hit from their duty rig. And that's usually where this gets just left off. It's like, well, see, 21 feet's the hard line. It's not, for a few reasons. There's a couple factors here that I don't think always get addressed as much as they should. The first one being is that rarely do we see single round stoppages from handguns. It's relatively uncommon. And so if you've got somebody that is already committed to an assault like that, even if you're able to achieve that draw and hit within that 21-foot distance, and even, a certain degree outside of that, it's still effectively a tie because you're getting them within the same time window that they're getting you. And that's not ideal because At this point, you have both taken damage. You are both diminished, again, to use some shipworks terminology. So that's not the point. The other thing, and I'm going to go into this a little bit later, but rarely when I hear this discussed, do they talk about starting hand position. Typically, I try to do a little bit of research, and I put sort of a call out and question some folks that would have a little bit more understanding of this than I did. And it seems like it was typically some kind of either fence or interview position, something to that effect. And that's important because, from my perspective at least, if I am presented with a problem that there is someone being aggressive and visibly armed, now, I've never been a cop, so my understandings of policy and use of force are limited. However, even as a concealed carrier, in a circumstance where I am presented with a visibly armed, hostile, threat that is presenting either hostile or semi-hostile intention, in that kind of distance, I feel like at the very least, my hand would probably be on my pistol already, if not drawn to a ready position, which is cutting out a chunk of draw time anyways. So, and again, I haven't ever really had the ability to test this theory because the force-on-force and scenario-based stuff that I've participated in up to this point has always been the close proximity, either entanglement or maybe, inside of 5 feet, let alone 5 yards. So again, it's theory, it's supposition. I haven't had an opportunity to test that idea yet, but it just strikes me as if somebody is presenting as that much of a potential problem, I don't know why I would voluntarily put myself further behind the curve than I've got to be already. And so from that escalation of force piece, I feel like starting with a holstered gun and hands in a offending position of some kind artificially extends that time window to a degree. I don't know necessarily by how much, but the time factor is another piece of it because, again, I don't have a duty holster. I do have the holster portion of my DeSantis shoulder rig has a thumb brake on it, as all good shoulder holsters do. Leather shoulder holsters do. But that also can come off and attach as a belt holster with a thumb brake. So I was going to see what the draw time differences were. Again, couldn't find my Mantis. But when you look at the time adjustments, like for example, Gabe White gives essentially a quarter-second grace period on his standards for somebody that's working from like a Safariland duty holster. And Todd Green gave a half-second grace period, or credit essentially, on the times for the fast when working from duty gear as well. So let's safely assume that somewhere between a quarter and a half second of added time to defeat the retention of a duty holster. But again, all of that is almost kind of irrelevant because the only thing that the Tueller principle, as I understand it, was really set out to show was that somebody armed with a contact weapon can absolutely pose a deadly threat at a significantly greater distance than the average lay person thinks. That's it. It's like the person with the screwdriver. Now, obviously, this is not what you would typically see somebody shanked with, I don't think, unless you really run afoul of your IT guy. But again, it's what I got in arm's reach. Work with me. Point is that it's not just reach out and touch you. So the entire concept was simply to allow, to give people the articulation of why it is acceptable and reasonable to use deadly force on someone before they're technically in range because of the reaction times involved and all this other stuff. The 21-foot part's kind of immaterial. And here's the other thing. Anybody walk around their normal life with a with a laser rangefinder or a set of ranger beads or something that you're actually using to calculate distance? No. Tom Givens has observed from the gunfights of Rangemaster alum that the typical defensive shooting generally takes place within a car's length, which is within about 17, 18-ish feet. If you're talking about either like an extended SUV, pickup truck, that kind of thing. But again, there's no distance markers. You can have a rough idea, but the whole point of it was never about the distance. It never was. Again, at least based on my interpretation. If I'm wrong on this, please correct me down below. But people get so hung up on the number, this sounds familiar, that people get so hung up on the number that they completely gloss over the entire point of what it was trying to show. And that's the critically important part. Because, again, my understanding is that when you get acclimated to shooting certain targets at certain distances, because that gets habituated, and I'm going to find this out here in not too short order, but like trying to make a 3x5 shot at 8 yards or 9 yards is arguably more challenging than it is at 7. Potentially might even be more challenging at 6 than 7, simply because the target area is a little less familiar. Now, again, this is one of those instances where shooting competition will definitely come into play, because as in terms of benefit, it's not the same typical fixed distances as you find in either classes or most conventional and traditional shooting drills. So again, this is one of the areas where shooting competition has absolute value and benefit for your defense craft. But I start to kind of digress and get off tangent. So when trying to incorporate the ideas behind the Tueller principle into, whatever your defense plan is, again, focus on the principle of it, which is the distance can be closed and reaction time comes into play and all this other stuff. So, arguably, yes, this is where some people, like the fella in last week's video, will attempt to use it at the time window as justification for trying to enhance their skill set. Which is not incorrect, but I think at the very least it's incomplete thinking. Because just like what Craig Douglas talks about in an entanglement with a timing decision, those same types of timing decisions exist outside of arm's reach as well. And so if, for example, you know that you consistently have a draw to first hit that's like 1.6, the question then becomes is it worth the time and the effort to bring that draw to first hit time down? Alternatively, what are the other skills, the other tactics that you have that you can employ that will extend that time window? And again, this is, I'll link to it down below, the conversation that Craig had with John Houtman over at Filster of Before the Beep is great. And when I started asking all this stuff, Cliff Byerly over at Hill Country Combatives pinged me, and we had a very brief exchange about it. Essentially, his point is like the Tueller concept completely glosses over incorporating movement. And again, I've never talked to Dennis Tueller about it, so I don't know why it was only ever dealt with in sort of static positioning. Might just be for consistency. I don't know, but again, you have the ability to put in the work and reduce your draw to first hit time. How much of that time and effort is worth it to you is up to you. I can't tell you that. But that's not the only part of the equation. You also have the ability to leverage your environment and your behavior and what you actually do within that process to extend your window of time as well. So, kind of the TLDR version of this, because I'm getting a little long-winded, is just that, is don't get so damn hung up on the number. Look at the concept and find out how the concept actually applies to your set of circumstances. Because at the end of the day, for most of us, unless we never stand in line, never do like grocery checkout and always do curbside pickup, never get in an elevator, there is way too much of day-to-day life for us to realistically keep everybody at 21 feet or greater. And in the normal confines of urban, suburban society, hell, quite frankly, even when I go to Southwest Louisiana and visit my in-laws, we're talking small town Louisiana. It's not like in the sticks, but it's definitely a little bit more on the rural side. Just day-to-day life, you are in close proximity with people. And when you look at how typical violent crime unfolds, folks are going to try and close that distance to initiate an assault. So the managing unknown contacts gives you distance, but, realistically trying to muck somebody at 7 yards just looks really weird. And if that's what you're trying to do, that's all you're ever going to do. So I want to know your thoughts on this. Was there anything I missed? Am I completely off base? Or does this give you something to think about? I want to hear that down in the comments. Other than that, hope everybody has a fantastic week. Stay dangerous. Stay sharp.